Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. Poppie is spelled Poppie. At my website, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour, or you can find my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer. We're going to jump right into our word of the week. Our word of the week is metaphysics, and metaphysics is a branch of philosophy. The most central definition of this is a branch of philosophy that deals with first principles, being, knowing, cause, time, space, etc. If you want to think of this in a more general sense, it's related to studying things that don't change. Okay, so it's kind of shifted toward studying things that don't change. So that is metaphysics again. We're going to jump right into our accidental lessons. We're going to be talking about something I came across more recently, and it's related to last week's episode. So last week, if you can't remember, we talked about skinny writing, and I don't know if I coined the term. If I did, I don't care. But if you've been writing long enough, you've heard of the idea of purple prose, and purple prose is flowery writing, and skinny writing, as I define it, is writing stripped of everything but what people say is needed. So it's as simple as possible. And last week I talked about this idea that it's not the case that one writing is the correct way of writing, right? The correct way of writing is whichever one is conveying what is meant to be conveyed, which is very broad, but at the same time, I think it covers what is needed, because there's so many variations on human experience, and there's so many variations on what is trying to be communicated, that I think to disregard or push away one type of writing is incorrect, and we need to be open to the possibility that a writing style we don't like is the one that fits best into what we need. So I talked about that last week. So skinny writing is that stripped bare writing. Purple writing is purple prose, that's what it's called, is flowery writing. That's another way of saying it. But this week we're talking about how every word that you write should be full of meaning. And we can say that in another way that doesn't convey it as clearly, but we can say it in another way that I think sounds better and is possibly better writing, or more poetic, I guess. Waste not a word. So every word should be full of meaning, or waste not a word. And that's what we're talking about today. And this is something that is something that younger or more inexperienced writers would fall into. And I think that if you're older and you've been writing some time, you realize that you need to do this. But if you're younger, you might fall into this. And I know that when I was younger, about more than a decade ago now, I was falling into wasting words, or using words in a way that I shouldn't have been using them. But I don't want you to mistake what I'm saying. I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying and take it in the wrong way. So I'm going to get into what we're talking about. So the point of bringing up what we talked about last week with skinny writing and purple prose is to convey this idea that there is no proper way to write. Okay, there are rules to the language, and I'm not talking about the rules of the language. If you are an American, if you are from the United States, you speak English, and you are from a specific region of the United States, there's a proper way that region uses English. There's a proper way that there's rules to the specific dialect you talk, right? Beyond that, there are rules. There are formalized grammatical rules that are put out that people try to, or they tend to follow as they are writing. But when I talk about no proper way, I am not talking about the rules of the language itself. Okay, I'm not talking about formalized grammatical rules, whether they're correct or they're mistaken rules. So there are certain rules that could be mistaken. We are looking at language incorrectly, and we're assuming incorrect things about the language. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about the dialect either. If you're someone like Mark Twain who writes in a dialect, Huck Finn is written in a way as if it's from I think he's like a 14-year-old kid. I'm not sure exactly the age of Huck Finn in the book, but he's writing as if he was Huck Finn. It's in first person, so there's a dialect that is it's written in a specific dialect, and it's not wrong that he's writing in that dialect, and I would say that writing is not incorrect just because there are certain things that are not grammatically correct according to proper English, or what we consider proper English, but that is correct for him to do that because it's within that specific dialect. What I mean when I say there is no one proper way to write, beyond even that, there's no one proper way to write because it all depends on context and the intention. What are you trying to convey, right? Going back to last week, what we're trying to convey is it might be better conveyed through very purple prose. Now, some people hate very purple prose, but if it conveys that specific idea, or beyond that specific idea, that experience, then it would be potentially be more proper to use purple prose in that sense. If you strip everything down and you want to convey something else that is entirely different, it might be better to actually convey it through skinny writing or skinny prose if we want to keep that idea of prose. So it all depends on the context, it all depends on the intention, and there may be a few other variables it depends on, but it's not there's not one proper way to do it, right? Because there's so many variations on what we're trying to convey, and that's the point here. So many variations on what we're trying to convey, there's not one proper way to write. Writing is as flexible as language is, and language is probably more flexible than I think it is. And I try to bend language as much as possible because it's fun. I bend language because you play around with it. That's the reason why you bend language. You see what it can do, what it can convey. I think that skinny prose, skinny writing, I like skinny writing better. Skinny writing is fun because you try to convey, you try to see what you can do with the least amount of words, or as stripped down as possible. So it's fun to be like, hey, what can I do with these specific words or this combination of words, or what can I do when I get rid of as much stuff as possible? And that's a good exercise to do to see what you can do, how the language works, what the best way to do things are. So going back to the central point, the writing and the way something is written depends on the context, depends on the intention behind the writing, okay? I can find there are several different instances where purple prose or more stilted prose that is it's more formal, that comes across. There's several different instances where I can see that as being the best way to write. I believe that Cloud Atlas, if I'm not mistaken, is written in a more it's written not more purpley, but it's written in a more stilted manner, a more old-fashioned manner that we're not used to anymore because we've taken our language and we've taken our writing and deformalized it. I don't know if the language has been deformalized, but the writing certainly has compared to what it was before. What we're talking about today with having every word full or wasting no words is often connected to purple prose and is set up as a critique and advice to those who write that way. Okay. What I mean by that is somebody might run into someone who writes purple. Someone who, and I guess could we add what would it be? White prose, yellow prose, green prose for skinny writing. Can we add a color to that? I don't know. Purple is like royalties. There's a lot of stuff. I think that's why it's called purple prose. I would say that if we have very skinny writing, if we have very simple writing, maybe it's red prose. And the reason why, well, that doesn't make sense necessarily. Red prose or green prose, maybe a primary color, something like that. But I'm actually getting off track. So it's often connected to purple prose because somebody writes purple prose, and what happens is somebody comes up and they see, well, there's a lot of words here, but do these words actually mean anything? And it might be the case that these words mean something, but it's more difficult to parse out the meaning when you have a lot of extra stuff in the prose that somebody is writing, okay? So this is often presented, this idea that every word should be full of meaning, you shouldn't waste any word. This idea often comes up when somebody's looking at that and they're like, well, these words don't mean anything, okay? But this advice is actually applicable to every type of writing. Every word should be full of meaning, or waste not a word. This actually isn't advice to cut unneeded words. Well, it is advice to cut unneeded words, but it's not an advice to just strip down everything to the bare bones of writing, okay? If there's words that are unneeded, if there's words that don't convey anything, then they probably should be cut. But it's not this advice to be like, oh, your writing should be as simple as possible. Your writing should be as straightforward as possible. Your writing should be as, I don't know, skinny as possible. That is not the advice. This advice is to have every word you write be meaningful, okay, which I think is a different thing. I think there's a clear distinction between these two ideas, because I can convey two things. I can convey two things that are essentially of the same meaning, and I can have one that is extremely simple, right? And I can have one that is a bit more complex and has a bit extra stuff in it, and they can mean very similar things. And one person might come up and they might be like, well, that one that has extra stuff, why don't we just strip all this extra stuff away? But when you add more words, when you add more to what you're writing, it narrows the meaning down, right? It helps people flesh out what that exact meaning is, okay? So if I say a dog, if I just have dog, right, that might be just fine in certain instances, but it might be the case that it's better to have, okay, a small dog, big ears, black and white, right? It's spotted, not stripes, it's spotted. So that narrows the meaning down. It gives a clearer picture of the experience you're trying to convey, right? The intention of this advice, the intention of saying, hey, all your words should be meaningful, is why are you using a specific word? Why are you using a specific word? Does that word convey meaning you intend to convey? This is actually a push toward understanding what words exactly mean and what they actually mean within how they're used within the language, or if people actually use these words. If I'm writing and I use a specific word I don't know, that word is conveying a very specific meaning, or most of the time it's conveying a specific meaning according to the definition given to it, and that definition is based off of how the word is actually used in language, right? But if I don't know what that word means and I'm just using it, then I am I'm doing the opposite of what is intended, or what this advice is trying to give. This advice is trying to say, hey, do you actually know what that word means? Beyond that, this advice pushes the writer to look at what they actually think. Pushes the writer to look at the experience that they're actually trying to convey. I know that if you have a long day, or if you are writing and you've been writing a long time, I know that everybody has these lapses of laziness where they're writing and they're like, yeah, I want to, I kind of have the basic idea of what's going to go on in this scene, or I have the basic idea of what I want to convey with this specific writing. I kind of know how that is. I understand. I have a vague idea of this, so I'm gonna put down words that convey that vague idea. And what this pushes the writer to do is to actually understand what they're trying to convey, first of all, because I can write about anything. I can't write about anything intelligently, but I can write about anything. What I can do, like, for example, if I want to write about physics, I've mentioned before, math is not my strong suit at all. If I want to write about physics, I can read a few things about physics, and I can write about physics in a way that people might think I actually understand physics. I'll put certain things in. I'll do a few. I'll hoodwink people with how I exactly use the words, or how I skirt around ideas. Somebody who knows physics well might catch on to it, but the regular person might not. What I haven't done is I haven't actually looked into those ideas, right? If I want to, this seems to happen in our news, and I'm not talking about, I think this happens across the board with people reporting news, and I think that if you are reporting news, it is your obligate. I think it's morally incorrect for you to have bad information if you are putting yourself up as a person in the news. Okay, to the best of your ability, I think you should have good information. I'm not talking about your bias. I think everybody has biases, but I think that it is your obligation in that situation to report things as clearly as possible and actually do your research. I think you're actually failing if you're a reporter, if you're a news station and you're failing to report things accurately because you're too lazy. I think you're failing morally, because that's your job. Because it's so important. It's so important to actually be accurate. It's so important to look into things. And there's been certain instances in the past 5 years that I've seen, and I've looked at it myself, and I've looked into it. I'm like, wow, this is completely reported incorrectly. But that's the same idea. If I want to report the news, I need to actually look into what it is. If I want to, it goes across the board with any profession. Okay, if I'm an accountant and I don't know what I'm doing, if I barely passed anything and I really don't understand accounting, I can't actually understand what's going on. I can't get to the bottom. I can't look at every detail in a tax return or whatever I'm doing. I have no idea what an accountant does for the most part, to be honest. I think they do books. They make sure all the numbers line up. I lived with an accountant for a while, or a guy who was going to school for accounting, and now he is a CPA. But I have no idea what they do. So I think they make sure all the numbers add up, and they make sure, oh, you're not actually going to get sued, or the IRS isn't going to audit you because your numbers add up, and you're not your numbers are all correct, and it's not incorrect information. So what they do, or what they can do, is they make sure that all the information on there is correct. So they need to know, they need to look into that intently. How does this relate, or how does any experience, or how does any profession relate to writing? I'm actually going to give you a parallel. I'm going to give you an analogy, and I think it'll help you understand better. If you are someone in the psychological field, let's just say you're a psychologist. You're not a psychiatrist, because there is a difference. The difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist is that a psychiatrist will spend less time with an individual. A psychologist spends more. A psychiatrist is an MD. A psychologist is not an MD. A psychologist is just I think that you can be considered a psychologist and have a master's degree, but a lot of them have PhDs. But a psychologist doesn't prescribe, at least from what I understand at this point. Maybe they do now. But from my latest information, they don't prescribe medicine. The psychiatrist can. So psychiatrists spend less time with people, and then they give people medicine. But what a psychologist does is they meet somebody and they have therapy sessions, right? The stereotypical idea is that the person's lying on a couch, which isn't the case. I don't think I think some people do lay on couches when they go to the psychologist, excuse me. But I think most people just sit and they talk, maybe across or something like that. And then, so what the psychologist does is they talk to the person, and they slowly dig into who that person is and how they function and how they work, right? And they figure out, okay, there's issues in this person's life, and I want to figure out where those issues come from. So these people understand the issues in their life, so they can deal with those issues, and I'll give them advice on how they deal with those issues. But I think, from what I understand, what a psychologist does is the thing that helps the person the most is actually the relationship. I think statistically that's what's been shown. But what the psychologist is doing mostly is making that person understand, okay, what is going on in my life, what is wrong, what is the issue, and then how can I bring myself to the point of resolving that issue. And I think the psychologist isn't necessarily there, not often there, to prescribe things for a person to do. I don't think most see that as the case. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to lead the person in the direction where the person is making their own decisions and discovering things for themselves. You as a writer are, in a sense, a psychologist. You are presented with an experience, right? So, for example, you want to convey as clearly as possible joy. You want to convey. You don't want to just say that the character was overjoyed. And I'm gonna get into why we convey these through characters in a second. You don't want to just convey that a character is overjoyed. You want the reader to experience the joy the character is feeling. Well, if you don't know what joy is, or you don't understand that experience, you cannot convey that experience. So what you do as a writer is you sit that experience down. You lay that experience down on a couch, and you become the psychologist of that experience. You look into that experience. You ask it questions. You see, oh, is this correct? Is this incorrect? Is this really what it is? Or is there something else that it is? And you try to get all the little pieces of that experience, right? It seems to be the case that to do this effectively, you need to be very self-reflective. You need to look in at yourself. You need to see how you work. You need to see how you experience things. And then you pull those experiences you pull the aspects of that experience from your own experiences, because we only have our own experiences to deal with. And then you take those pieces and you put them down on paper. And it might take a long time to actually get a clear picture of what that thing is. I have a harder time with, I think, positive emotions. I think some people have a harder time with negative emotions. I don't have as hard a time with that. There are certain things in my life that I deal with on almost a constant basis, whether positive or negative. And with those, I think maybe it's easier to write negative emotions, because if you are someone who is very deeply self-reflective, you're more self-reflective when you have negative emotions, right? But if you've never had certain experiences, right? If you've never had a child, you're not going to have the same level of experience that a person does who did, or a person who has multiple, or if you've never had a child die, that's a different experience. If you've never been married, or if you've never even been in a relationship, that is a different experience, because if you've never been in a relationship, and I think this is how a lot of guys work. I don't know about girls because I'm not a girl. How a lot of guys work, and this, if you're a girl, you can use this and you can use it to your advantage, or don't manipulate guys. That's really mean. But I think they have not a mythological, what am I trying to say? They have not a dream, but they have this idea in their head that everything's going to be perfect, and they're going to be fulfilled, and they're going to be, oh, this is going to go so well, and life is going to be this constant high. And when you get into a relationship, whether you're a guy or you're a girl, you realize you fight, you realize you get into a routine, you realize the excitement goes away, you realize that things change, things turn, and you can become dissatisfied with each other or annoyed at each other, and you can yell at each other, or you can get into a rhythm where it's satisfying and it's safe, and you know each other, and you're moving toward things with each other, or it's a mix of both. So it's very complex. The human experiences are very complex. Humans are very complex. The experiences are very complex. To actually have meaningful words, you actually have to understand those experiences. And I can admit that there's many times in my life where you get busy, and you're writing, and you want to get your writing done. You're like, well, I have, I don't know, 1,000 words. Maybe you write 500 words a day, whatever you write, as long as you're writing. If you're writing consistently, I don't care. If you're writing consistently every week, that's kind of what I view it as. Some people think, oh, you're not a writer unless you write every single day. Well, if you can take an hour out every single week and you can write, then I consider you a writer. You're doing it consistently. If you write in general, I consider you a writer. Because there's a lot of variations and a lot of things that come into life. But it gets tiring, and sometimes you don't have time to reflect on those things, and you brush it off and you go over it, and you're like, that's fine. I'll fix it in the edit, because that's how everything goes. But I think that we're all doing ourselves a disservice when we do that. I think I'm doing a disservice when I'm like, I'm just tired. It's been a long day. It's been a long week. It's been a long year, a long lifetime. And I just want to get this done and get it out. But I think that our writing is going to be better if we actually take time to understand those things. So that's the first part. So we are taking time to actually understand what we're trying to convey. And then we actually have to take time to understand how to convey those ideas, experiences. I think it's better just to say experiences. I think that covers more ground. We have to understand why we have to understand how to convey those experiences. And it goes beyond the definitions, right? I think it's important to understand what a word means, but just using a specific word doesn't convey those things. I think oftentimes that just using a specific word is, in some ways, it's lazy, and I probably fall into this more than I would like to. But you think, oh yeah, that word conveys exactly what I want it to convey. But writing goes beyond just using big words that have a very specific meaning, if that makes sense. There's another aspect of this that I want to get into as well, but it goes beyond just using that as a specific meaning, just using words with a very specific meaning. Meaning comes from the context of the word as well. What I mean by this is what came before the word, what comes after. And I think I see context as the sentence itself. I see context as the paragraph. I see context as the entire book. Okay. If you're going to focus on any of those pieces, I would say focus on the paragraph. I don't know from what I understand, or from my own experiences, focusing on the paragraph is better than focusing on the sentence, or focusing on the chapter, or focusing on the entire book. It's big enough that you can, if you can hang things together, if you can make things mesh in a paragraph, if you skip to the next paragraph, it's going to be easier because people understand, okay, this is a new thought. But the paragraph itself, I think, conveys one single thought or one single experience, depending on what you're writing. So I think if you're going to focus on any, I think it would do you best to focus on the paragraph. I think you need to play around with that and see if that does work for you. For me, it seems to be the case with my writing experience. But the meaning of something comes from the context of the word or of the paragraph or of the chapter, the things that come before, the things that come after. And the context isn't just the meaning of the thing. So the context is what the sentence is trying to convey as a total, in totality. What the paragraph is trying to convey in totality, it's the meaning itself, but it's also how things flow, right? It's the sound of the language as well. The only thing I can think of right now, so if you think of comedy has a rhythm to it as well. If you're watching a comedian, comedians have a rhythm to it as well. And if you watch a comedian, what you'll notice is a comedian has a story if they're telling something to the audience, and the comedian has this piece of information that doesn't that hangs by itself. It's connected to the joke, the body of the joke, but it's the punchline. The punchline hangs by itself. The punchline is, in a sense, a separate entity. The punchline is the most salient piece that the comedian is telling. Everything's but you need the joke, you need the context to get to that punchline. But the punchline is the thing that people remember. The punchline encapsulates, I just hit my mic a little bit, I'm sorry if you hear that. The punchline encapsulates that joke. The punchline is what everything's leading up to. And you can do that with your writing as well. And I think that if you think of writing as a joke or structured like a joke, you're writing toward a goal where there's this satisfying conclusion. In your paragraph, you're writing toward a goal where there's a satisfying conclusion. In the sentence, you're writing toward a goal. In the chapter as well. If you're writing thrillers, oftentimes that satisfying conclusion to most chapters is going to be a cliffhanger. But at the end of the chapter, and I try to do this, and it's harder than it seems, is what you try to do is you try to get to the end where if somebody ended a chapter at that point, they're like, oh, that was really satisfying. It's not necessarily a cliffhanger. It's not necessarily a cliffhanger. The end of a chapter can be just what a person says. It can be a description. It can be anything, but it has that punchline-like feel to it. And that's what I mean by there is a specific rhythm that you need. There is a specific meaning. So with a joke, you need that meaning at the beginning, and the beginning and middle I think are just as important as the end because it serves the meaning that comes out at the end. And in some things that I've written, when I'm writing, I only remember one instance of this, but I'm sure it happens more than I think. I wrote a paragraph and I had a punchline essentially where I had a specific line. So it was more of describing something more negative about the world that the characters existed in. And then it has one single line. So it has all these bad things, and it has one single line that is kind of like a jab to the chest for the person reading. But at the same time, it's the opposite. It's conveying something that is the opposite of what I was trying to convey before, but it makes what I conveyed before so much worse. So it could be that it could be something that you're writing something really positive and then you're conveying something really negative at the end. You're writing something really positive and you're putting a bow on it essentially at the end, or you're having a character react to it. So one thing that I've done in the past is I have used italics for the thoughts of characters. And the reason why I've used italics for the thoughts of characters, very specific reason. I stole this from Frank Herbert. This is actually, surprisingly, that was the first time I saw it. The reason why I used italics for the thoughts of the characters is because I can string together dialogue of characters and italics without telling the reader that I'm doing it. I don't have to explicitly say this character thought this or said it. I can actually have the dialogue and the italics right next to each other, and the reader knows, oh, this is what's happening right here. And what I can do with that is I have more pieces to move around. And what that allows me to do is it allows you to pick up the pace, but it allows you to create a punchline that jumps into another line of thinking from the character, or more writing that I'm doing that pushes the story along. So what I do is you can actually start with the dialogue of the character. So you'd start with the dialogue of the character for a very specific example, and the character's talking, or two characters are talking, and then you jump to a punchline that is the thought of the character, and then that punchline can lead into the thinking of the character, and then that thinking has a punchline, and it can lead back into dialogue, or it can lead back into description, or something like that. So it goes from punchline to punchline to punchline. The hardest part of writing for me is writing the end of a book. I think writing the beginning is a lot easier. Writing the end is the hardest part for me, because I want that punchline. I want that to stick in the person's mind. I want the person to be like, oh, wow, yeah, that's really good. That was a really good ending to it. That encapsulated what was going on, but it captured me in a way, in the same way the beginning of the book captured me. So I think that if you think of it that way, it makes a lot of sense. So it isn't just the meaning, it's the flow of the words. If you watch a comedian, the comedian is talking, and suddenly they have this pause, and then they say the joke. And then they wait for the laughter. And then they say another part of the joke that brings even more laughter. And then what comedians also do, what television shows that are comedies do, is they have jokes that continue on later on in the show. I like the show Arrested Development. I like the first 3 seasons. Let me clarify that. And what they do is they build on their comedy, right? You can watch each individual episode by itself, but the comedy builds. The comedy, if you watch all the first 3 seasons, let's just not talk about the rest and act like those don't exist. I think it's the first 3 that were the original. If you watch those seasons, they keep on building and building and building, and there's jokes that come up again, and there's things that come up again. And it's very clever, because they're not trying to they are creating a story, but I think the intention of the writers was to keep those jokes extending beyond just the first episode or their second episode. They all string together, and they all keep on getting better and better and bigger, and you're recalling what was going on before. But in comedies, that's what happens a lot. So you can do that in writing as well. You can write, let's just say you have one standalone book, and people do this quite often, but I don't think people think about it as comedy. Maybe they do, and maybe I'm completely off my rocker here. But let's just say you have something in the beginning of a book. You have foreshadowing, but your foreshadowing is really structured more like a joke than writing. What people often do is they put foreshadowing in, or they put symbolism in, and they don't try, or it doesn't seem like they try to get that punch when they bring it up again. What I always try to do is I don't want to make it funny, but I want to get that same feeling of a comedic punch, right? I want to get that same feeling of a punchline in comedy, where you're reading something, you get through half the book, and there's all this stuff in the book, and there's a point made, and there's a comedic punch, there's a punchline that you create in the book. Not funny, just punchline in what I'm talking about right now. There's a punchline you create in the book, and the punchline means one thing in this part of the book, right? It means a very specific thing. Maybe you have a character who's joking around. Maybe you have a character who's dealing with something really hard. Maybe you have 2 characters talking, and it comes up then. It could be anything. There's a million different ways to do this. But then at the bottom, the last 25% of the book brings up that punchline again, and it twists it in a way, and it renews it, right? It makes it new. It's like, oh, I didn't think of it like that. That has the same amount of punch as the one before. And that's what jokes do in comedies, or at least what I see. I'm not a comedian. I don't understand the structure of jokes or anything like that to the same extent a comedian would. But I think that's what jokes do in comedy. So if you watch a joke or you watch a comedian, I would say, hey, go watch somebody who's really good. They have their joke. They have their initial punchline. And then like half an hour later into their show, they suddenly bring up that same punchline again, and it's just as funny or funnier than it was originally. And that's the same effect I think we're trying to get in writing. And that's what I think we should do. And that's what I mean by context. That's why I think context is important. In some cases, the context doesn't have that same punch, but you still need it. In some cases, it does have that same punch, and I think we should try to reach for something similar. But that same punch doesn't come across in the same way comedy. In some cases, that punch elicits sadness. In some cases, that punch elicits like happiness or elation, or sometimes you're like, wow, this just relaxes me, or you understand what's going on. There's something going on in your head. The writer is so clear. The writer conveys what they need to so well. They use the correct words. They use the correct words in the correct rhythm, in the correct context. That when you read it, you're just like, yeah, this makes complete sense. I am wrapped up in this world. I can feel it. I can see it. I can taste it. I can almost touch it. It's almost like I'm there. Okay. To bring this back to the word itself, because maybe that will help people. If you think of it as, you need to think of it in the context, definitely, but if you think of the words you're using, the sound of the word matters as well. Not just the meaning, but the sound itself, because sounds convey what somebody is feeling. There's more than just it's not just the sound that is conveying what somebody's feeling, right? But the sound does convey something. The sound of the language conveys something as well. If you have something that's really fast-paced, you probably want something. If you have a thriller, you probably want your writing to match. Probably, not necessarily. You want your writing to match, be a little bit faster at certain places. You want the reader to feel that. You want, when your reader reads that, when they speak to themselves in their head, when they read it out loud in their brain. That was a contradiction, right? They want to actually feel that and how the language works. So here's a few words that mean this. They don't mean the same thing perfectly, but they sound different. And I'm just going to say them, and I'm not going to go into it too much. But each of these means something a little different, but they convey a specific thing with their sound. So these all are synonyms: conceal, cover, mask, camouflage, shroud, veil. In some cases, you can use... let's just say that we're writing something and the word mask, right? So I have a few different M's, and with the rhythm of what I'm writing, mask fits in the best. In some cases, you want to switch it up and you want to flip it on its head, right? So it might be the case that, mask fits the best, right? But it might be the best case that you use veil. And the reason why it might be the best case is that somebody's reading and they're expecting a specific word because of how things are flowing, and suddenly you're throwing something in that's different. And this is hard. You have to get used to it. You have to really practice, and you have to really try things out and see what works best, because just because you're switching it up doesn't mean it's going to work. But I throw in the word veil, and what that also does is it changes the nuance of the word. And somebody might be reading and there's something like veil. Where did that come from? But it doesn't it changes how the person is seeing it, because they're not just, a mask is different than a veil. And veiling something is different than masking something as well. So all these mean something different. All these have a very distinct sound to them too. And it might be the case that you need to switch it up and have something completely different. It doesn't always work. Sometimes you need to go with the conventional and go with what seems to fit the best, but sometimes you need to shift it because you need to jar people out of what they're reading. You need to keep it exciting, and that's how you keep things exciting. But yeah, all these mean around the same thing, not completely, but all these mean something similar. They have their own nuances, but all of them sound very different. So be aware of the sound of the language. So this technically is advice to use the correct words. Use the correct words in context. To use the correct words in both the context of how it sounds, what it means, the bigger picture. Whether you're writing a story, whether you're writing a short story or a book or just a paragraph or an essay, it applies to all types of writing actually. But what I want to remind you is that the right words don't exist. Instead of seeing this as like, I'm trying to find the exact right words, because there's so many different ways to convey things, and each person's going to have their take on how to convey something, and each person probably has a nuanced view of what they're experiencing. The point of this is to really say that you shouldn't have meaningless sentences. And I don't think this happens often. Like I said, I think that meaningless sentences happen more with younger people. I think that if you're older and you're starting to write, this happens less. But there was this trend from the boomers. I don't know. It probably still happens today. I think Kurt Cobain was also guilty of this. It happened in music, and the trend, and it happens in art too, but in a different way. The trend was to put whatever words together that just kind of fit together. And I think that if you're writing music, you have a tendency to do this more because you need to fit it into the rhythm, the melody of the music, what fits with the music, right? But there was this trend to just put random words together. It was meaningless. And I think art shouldn't be meaningless, right? Art should always be conveying something. Art should always, and not just ideas. I think it's more about the experience that they're conveying. And I think that having meaningless words is antithetical in almost all cases to art, what good art is. I think it always should be conveying, be full of meaning. I think it always should be, I think every word should be full of meaning. Every piece of that art should be full of meaning. I'm not against having certain things that look like they're meaningless and are actually full of meaning, but I think that the person who is reading or listening or looking at an art piece needs to be able to actually understand that meaning without the artist telling them what it is. And the reason why is because eventually everybody's going to die. And when you create art, you are putting something out into the world that is, it might not exist 100, 200, 300, 500 years from now, but it might. And you're not going to be around to be like, hey, this is what this means and this is what that means. And I think that the reason why we create art is so we don't have to stand next to our book as somebody is reading it and be like, yeah, this is what this means and this is what that means. It's supposed to stand by itself. Right? The piece of art is supposed to stand by itself. The piece of art is supposed to convey something. If you are telling somebody what the piece of art is conveying and the person's looking at it or reading it or listening to it, they're like, I don't get it. I think you failed. I think you failed to convey what you're doing unless that person doesn't speak your language or that person is incapable of understanding that thing. There are certain things that make a person incapable of understanding that art as you meant it to be understood. If I'm looking at a piece of art, but I'm blind, I can't look at it. I can't actually understand that art as you meant it to be understood, that painting, right? This is the final thing I'm going to leave you with, and that's it. The awesome thing about art is that you have a chance to convey something deeper than the meaning of a sentence or even a string of sentences. The whole that you're creating, the whole that you're making from art, it's greater than the sum of its parts. You put all these things together and you're getting something different. You're getting something beyond what you're making. You're getting something that goes beyond the words you're using and the meaning of the words. It goes, if you're writing a book, it goes beyond the paragraphs you're using. It goes beyond the chapters you're putting together. When you look at it in its totality, you're getting something that is beyond that, that's conveying something. You're putting all these little pieces together, and it's getting, if you're doing it well, if you really know what you're doing, and I don't know, I don't know if I can. Maybe I can do it. Maybe I hoodwink people into thinking I can. I don't know, because it's hard to judge your own stuff. But if you can do that, you're conveying as close as possible, you're conveying the experience of yourself, of what a person goes through in certain situations. And I think that's really cool because all writing is marks on a piece of paper. They mean certain things, but they're marks on a piece of paper, right? They're words, they're paragraphs. They're just, we print stuff off. If you don't know the language, you don't even know what it means, but you're conveying something with those very humble marks on a piece of paper that is the height of experience of anything, right? Humans have experiences that are so much more complex than everything else we see. And I think that's so cool. And I think that it's humbling because, like I said, it's just marks on a piece of paper. And if I hope that everybody listening is lucky enough to be able to put things together and it goes beyond what even they think they're doing or what they think they're capable of. congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things he's doing, creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe. Subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places, all right? So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.